All right, so this time around we are talking data types. There are tons of them to cover in Python, 15 built in, and of course, as we go along, we'll learn how to make our own. But we're going to cover most of those 15, if not all of them. I at least want to mention all of them. We'll see. We're going to dive straight in. We're going to talk about just what a variable is. We covered that already on a surface level, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the underlying technical aspects of it and go into some naming conventions. And then, of course, we're going to look in detail at three types of data type. We have our numeric types, our non-numeric types, and our collection types. In reality, Python breaks these out into several categories. I believe there's 7 or 8 of them. So this is just my way of breaking down the ones that I want us to put particular focus on. So, refreshing ourselves on what a variable is, that is a container for a single piece of data. And that piece of data can be a number, it can be a true-false value, it could be some text, or it could be a whole group of variables. You can, yes, contain a bunch of variables inside of one. Those are your collection types. We'll get into more about those later. Now, we call them variables because they are variables in most programming languages. But the Pythonic name for them is names, because when these are created, they are placed in what is called a namespace. A namespace you can think of as like a glossary of all of the objects that are in use by Python. And there are 4 types of namespaces. So you have your built-in namespace, which includes everything that is built into the language. So things like the print function that we called in our first programming assignment. That is part of the built-in namespace. Then you've got your more local ones that contain the things that you make, the variables that you create. And we'll talk about scope as we go along. Right now, we aren't covering enough things for scope to really mean anything to you, but once we start working on some multi-line constructs, some loops, some conditionals, then we're going to talk more about scope and where and when we can use particular variables that we've created. So remember that the namespace is the glossary. That's the best way to describe it. It goes into a lot more detail than that, but it's a really powerful underlying tool of Python. In Python specifically, data types are flexible, or variables are flexible in what their type can be. We call this soft typing. In a way, Python is sort of a middle ground between soft and hard typing. So you can change a variable to a different data type just by assigning it a type, or a value with a different type. Or you can specifically invoke the function that is related to that type. And we'll get to that later. So that's some general information to remember on what a variable is, what a namespace is. I encourage you to read up more about namespaces. Again, this is a very powerful tool of Python. Now, when we talk about how to name our variables, we generally want them to be something meaningful. So, you might have a variable that contains a username, and we would just naturally call that username. There are reasons to include single line or abbreviated variable names, and it is partially up to you to use your best judgment at what point are these contracted variable names, at what point do they still make sense. But in general, we don't want to use single letters because most of them are taken up by arguments and functions. We'll get to explaining what all that means later on, but things like X, Y, and Z, we use those in coordinate planes. I, We use that in loops, J for complex numbers because I is already taken, and so on and so forth. So we want to avoid using these variable names that are already common conventions within programming. So, like I said, we want them to be meaningful. Something like, username, number of users, where something like N would be more inappropriate as a naming choice. So, let's talk more about variable naming conventions. There's a ton of different ways that we can name our variables, but some things to remember. Number one is there is no character limit. We can have these be as long as we want in theory, but we don't want them to be insanely long. I have seen programs where the variable names and function names are entire sentences. And if that's what your program calls for, then that's what your program calls for. But in the majority of cases, we don't need more than 2 or 3 words to describe what our variable does. They can contain alphanumeric characters, that's capital letters, lowercase letters, and digits 0 through 9, as well as underscores. They do not include dashes because dash is used as the minus symbol. So they must begin with a letter or underscore. You cannot begin a name in Python with a number. So, again, no digits in the first letter, and underscores are not generally recommended as a first character. It's highly recommended that you stick to letters, whether they be uppercase or lowercase. It can be almost any name you want as long as it is nothing that is already taken. Like, you can't make a variable and call it print. You can't make a variable and call it sum or int or float. These are names that are already taken up. All the ones that I just named are functions. So, again, your name should make sense. It should be descriptive. It should tell me at a glance, it should tell you at a glance, or anybody reading your code, what the variable is all about. And of course, you've always got comments. If you can't make that 100% clear, you can use comments to clarify. Cannot be language keywords. Again, there's a bunch of function names. You also can't use language keywords like import, def, class, break, for, in. All of these, you cannot use them because they are keywords that Python looks for to do specific things. And lastly, everything in Python is case sensitive. So name with an uppercase N is a completely different variable from name with a lowercase n. So bear that in mind. Make sure that you follow a consistent style of capitalization so that you don't mess this up. Speaking of which, there are a ton of different styles that you could follow to name your variables. So let's go through some of these. Of course, you have the single character. That is, again, specific use cases such as coordinate planes, loops, complex numbers, things like that. You have all lowercase, which a lot of people tend to prefer. I personally, we scroll down a little bit and we see mixed case. That is what I prefer, but we'll work our way down to that. All uppercase. This is commonly used for constants in a lot of languages. So variables that are not intended to change value. So if for whatever reason you need, say, the Euler constant in your code and you actually need to write it out yourself, then you would create a constant and it would be in all capitals generally. You could always just keep to the same naming conventions and no one's going to fault you. You could do lowercase or uppercase with underscores. But as it says here, usually if we're talking about keeping our code Pythonic, the way that we typically write our variable names is lowercase with underscores. But for the time being, I just want you to go with what you prefer, because I'm going to be using mixed case. And when you get a job out in the really real world, you're going to have an employer who has a particular code style for you to follow. And then you will learn how that they want their code written and follow that convention. So while you're just writing your own code, your own practice code, use whatever convention you like. But lowercase with underscores is the generally accepted convention for Python. We have camel case, so named because you have the periodic humps in it from the capital letters. This is a preferred style for many, many languages. And again, mixed case where the first letter, unless it's an abbreviation like SSI or something along those lines, like FERPA or whatever we're talking about, like an acronym. The first letter is lowercase, and then every subsequent word is capitalized. So we have camel case with underscores. This one is often frowned upon. It's generally not recommended that you do this one because the point of the capital letters, the point of the underscores, is to show separation of words. We don't need to do both. And then we have the trailing underscore. This one's commonly used for avoiding name conflicts. And what we mean by that is, say you're using somebody else's library and you want to avoid accidentally calling your names something that is in the namespace of the code that you are borrowing. Then we have the dunder methods. This is going to be covered in our last lecture when we start talking about classes, when we start talking about object-oriented programming. This two underscores, name two underscores, we call that type of naming dunder, short for double underscore. This again has very specific use, and we'll see that when we start talking about OOP. Okay, whatever set of styles you choose, be consistent. Be consistent. This is part of making your code readable. So always use the same convention. If you use different conventions for different purposes, that is fine. Again, see uppercase, which is commonly used for constants. It is okay to have a particular style for a particular use case as long as, again, you're being consistent. Generally speaking, class names, when we start talking about object-oriented programming, I personally do those in camel case to distinguish them from everything else. And the last thing, like I said here, employers will have their own style for you to follow. So right now, you are creating your own style. And when you're doing your own projects, you're free to use that style. But when you get a job and you have a boss looking over you, you're going to have to follow their convention. All right, so in the next lecture, we're going to talk about numeric types. This was just a quick overview. So next time we're going to talk about integers, we're going to talk about floating point numbers, and we're going to talk about complex numbers. And I'm going to make mention of a few other things. So stay tuned.